and welcome to Big Tent USA. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Gail Shields Miller, and I'm an advisor at Big Tent. I'm delighted to host today's discussion with Sarah Janes and Jess Piper. At Big Tent USA, we put democracy over partisanship. There are 83 days until the election. I almost want to say that over, 83, okay? So join us in doing something. Here are three great things you'll find on our website to do right now. One, visit our Do Something page for actions to take, no matter what your level of civic experience is. Two, check out our Project 2025 page, which explains how the plan will negatively impact you and your family and is already damaging Americans in red states. And three, use our talking points tool to master difficult conversations on today's issues. And now I am thrilled to introduce you to our guests. Sarah Janes grew up in a small town on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State and began her career organizing on climate issues in rural communities. Since then, she's been a trailblazer in the progressive movement. Sarah led the development of one of the first state progressive donor networks, Washington Progressive Alliance, and has coached emerging donor alliances from Alaska to New Hampshire to Alabama as senior advisor to Committee on States. Sarah is recognized for her expertise leading innovative campaigns, integrating field experiments, digital platforms, and transformative narrative, and manages to stay relentlessly optimistic and obsessed with winning. Jess Piper is a mother to 5 and a grandmother to 3 and lives on a small farm on the Missouri-Iowa border. She was born and raised in rural America. She was an American literature teacher for 16 years. After the 2016 election of Trump, Jess became politically active. Jess ran for office in 2022 for state representative in HD1 in Northwest Missouri. Jess is executive director of Blue Missouri and writes The View from Rural Missouri on the Substack platform. So a big welcome to Big Tent to both Sarah and Jess.
Well, thank you for spending time with us today talking about the exciting promise of rural politics. I'm Sarah Janes with the Rural Democracy Initiative, and we're a collaboration of funders who invest together to build progress in rural America, and in doing so, change what's possible in the country. So I'll give a short overview about why rural voters have so much potential and the incredible network of groups that are unleashing this power, and then I'll share some highlights from our recent rural poll and then turn it over to Jess. So just for starters, if you're like me, in the past few weeks, you've probably pivoted from intense anxiety and mild depression about politics to this kind of pulse-pounding hope and enthusiasm. And frankly, it's been a little distracting after just kind of grinding it out for the past 18 months. So I kind of really need to settle down and get to work, especially with everyone falling in love with Tim Walz, who really is the charming side of rural America that we talk about all the time on full display. And so people really just want to know more about rural. I've personally worked in politics for 30 years and won a lot in some really tough circumstances. And I've managed to remain hopeful and relentless throughout. And I recommend two things. The first thing is that you really want to find the gaps. There are high impact places where you can make a unique difference. And this is where you just want to lean all the way in. And then the second thing is just don't spend any of your limited energy worrying about all the things that we can't control. So by virtue of being on this call, you have the opportunity to help fill one of these big critical gaps, which is investment in rural people and places. And that's really RDI's mission. We're a grant maker. We give to 150 groups in small towns and rural areas across 20 states. And these are really skilled and scaled operations that are doing high impact work. They're doing civic engagement, organizing, politics, communications, policy change. So I hope this gives you heart. Most people don't know that this work is happening out there. And we're also a learning community. We've learned a lot over the past 5 years. And so we're really ready for this big moment. So I'm going to share my screen for some of the big lessons, and I'll share the deck afterwards. So don't worry, I'm going to move quickly through these slides, but you'll get it all later. So let me see if I can share my screen. Here we go, share. All right, this should work for you. So here's the first thing we learned is that rural voters are the most persuadable. In the last 10 years, they swung 8%, which is more than any other geographic segment. And so maybe what most sets our network of rural groups apart is that we know how to talk to the broadest base of persuadable working class people, because every single one of our groups has to work across divides to make things better for their rural communities. Now, this might surprise you, but rural folks are really for progress on our key issues. Last fall's abortion measure in Ohio showed again that rural people support a woman's right to make decisions about her own health care. We win 70% of our rural school board fights against book bans and for accurate education. And rural folks are passionate economic populists. They are for cheaper prescription drugs, for tougher regulations on Wall Street, all of those economic policies. The other thing is that rural people are not just white. 1 in 4 rural residents are people of color, and these numbers are growing fast, and they're even higher in the South and Southwest. You can take a longer look at this fascinating map later. On the challenges side, disinformation is especially potent in rural areas where people are highly relational and they get much of their information from Facebook and other digital platforms where they are just relentlessly targeted. So experts tell us that a lot of the disinformation seen by urban audiences got its start in rural communities where it spreads like wildfire and it gains strength and it becomes much harder to snuff out there. All right, here's my last lesson. 63% of rural young people are infrequent or uncommitted voters. So that's 30 million people. And of all the demographics, they are the most undecided and the least contacted, especially young rural voters of color who lean more progressive. And the best way to activate these voters is through trusted people in their local community. That's why we created our Rural Youth Voter Fund that's moving $10 million to groups that are engaging rural young people. Now, focusing some on this year's election, a fundamental RDI premise is that gains of 3 to 5% in small towns and rural areas will swing statewide outcomes. So when you think about it, if you lose 65-35 in Clark County, Wisconsin, instead of 70-30, you're adding a lot of votes. And if you're looking at 70% of the electorate, there are a lot of places to go out there and find those votes. And that's exactly what happened in 2022 in Pennsylvania, where rural voters moved 2.4%. And this swing resulted in a rural gain of more than 110,000 votes, which was the margin of victory for Fetterman. And also last spring, earlier in the year, rural and small town voters in Wisconsin moved 5% towards Protasiewicz for Supreme Court. And that accounted for 42% of her total statewide votes, which is more than Milwaukee and Dane County, which is the Madison area, combined. And then when our groups invest in local candidates doing deep year-round local organizing, these candidates often win outright. So these local candidates mobilize their base around really practical issues that touch their communities' everyday lives. Tim Walz's congressional wins in a very red district demonstrate this. And a recent example that we had in northern Michigan 2 years ago, Betsy Kofia spent years organizing farm workers around driver's licenses for immigrants before she ran for the legislature. When she ran, thousands of farm workers made sure that their friends and family were registered to vote, even covering their shifts on election day to make sure they could go to their polls. And Kofia ended up winning by 700 votes, and her race flipped the state legislature. So when these voters turn out to propel these local leaders, who they know personally, to victory, they then vote up the ballot to move statewide results. That's why local organizing is so important. And then the last thing I want to say is that these rural groups are really on the front lines of a pitch battle to ensure that everyone can get over the barriers to vote and have their votes count. So they'll make sure there are drop boxes on Native reservations in Arizona, that polling places in rural Georgia and North Carolina are safe places, joyful spaces for Black and Latino voters with music and games. They make sure that young people in rural Wisconsin are introduced to the voting process as poll workers, and that small town election officials and the local media and their business leaders everywhere are prepared to defend the true outcomes when they happen in November. So since 2020, our network have really figured out which tactics do the most to educate and persuade and turn out voters. And now we're making sure that they have the resources to scale up, and they can be a major force in 2024, because this year, if you look at the Senate map, it's squarely rural territory. You've got tough states like Montana and Ohio, and then all the super close states where rural voters helped win in 2022, like Pennsylvania and Arizona. And the presidential battlegrounds like Michigan and Wisconsin and North Carolina, if you look at them, they're almost half small town and rural voters. So just to close up, I wanted to show you a few highlights from our rural poll. The full poll results are up on our website, so you can go deeper on your own. And we did this poll in April. We surveyed 1,700 voters in small towns and rural parts of battleground states. And I'm just going to give you my top 5 takeaways, and you can look at the rest of them later. But the first one is that rural voters are highly undecided. If you look, it's 15% that were undecided overall. And then people of color in rural areas and young people, 28 and 24% were undecided. So this is where you pick up that 3 to 5% of the vote that swing statewide races in these undecided voters. And many are also very under-contacted, especially rural people of color and young people. It's a big reason why they're so undecided. So this is a complicated slide, but if you just look down here at these pink squares, these are BIPOC folks and young people, and they're 22 and 24% likely to say that they just haven't heard anything from campaigns. But when they actually hear from campaigns, they move towards Democrats. So just over the course of our poll, if you see, there was a 6% gain in people of color just from the beginning of the 20-minute poll to the end of the 20-minute poll from what they heard in the poll. So you need to get out and talk to folks, and they will move. Of course, this poll was taken before the Harris-Walz ticket. So we're polling again later this month, and we expect a lot higher support from rural young voters and voters of color, who are probably hearing much more about the campaign, since we saw that 70% of these demographics get their news from YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook, which is where the Harris campaign has really excelled in contrast to the Biden campaign. All right, the other thing I wanted to say is that rural voters support abortion rights at stunningly high levels. If you look here, 77% say that either they're personally against abortion, but they don't believe government should prevent someone from making that decision for themselves, or that they personally support the right to abortion and believe it should be legal and available. 77%, that's a lot of rural people. And also 74% agree that we should trust women and their doctors when it comes to abortion, not politicians. The other thing is that they are economic populist progressives who are concerned about rising costs, and they favor a pro-worker, middle-class out message, which we help develop closely. And when you look at this, you'll hear Harris using these words a lot. It's kind of magic words for working class voters. Oh, here's the message right here. We should invest in policies that lower costs and raise incomes for working people. Hardworking Americans are the engines of our economy, and when they can thrive, the economy grows, businesses prosper, and America is more competitive. 57% of rural people overall support that message. But this is a really important point, which we'll talk about later. When you associate that message with Democrats, support for the pro-worker agenda drops by 19 points, because there's a huge Democratic Party brand problem. And Jess and I will talk a little bit about why this is later on in the conversation. And then the last thing I just want to say is we ask them who they trust, because the messenger is more important than the message that you're sending. And I thought it was very interesting, in addition to friends and family, rural voters most want to hear from veterans, farmers, small business, and local law enforcement. So it's no wonder that Walz is really catching hold with this audience. There's a lot more to talk about in the poll, but I'm going to give Jess the floor, and I'll let you peruse the rest of the poll at our website at ruraldemocracyinitiative.org. So take it away, Jess.
Hi, friends. My name is Jess Piper. I'm coming to you from the cornfields and the bean fields of Northwest Missouri. I'm so happy to be with you today. Sarah was giving you a great breakdown of the data, and I'm going to give you some of the stories that I heard. I ran in a district, by the way, I lost, but I ran in a district that hadn't elected a Democrat in 32 years. I ran in a district that never had elected a woman. And so I knew what I was going up against, but I did it anyway. And here's why: because it matters that we give rural folks a choice, right? And just by the simple fact that I was in this very rural space raising money, they couldn't avoid me. They couldn't stop thinking about me. They were throwing money into a race they hadn't thought about in decades. By running, I forced my Republican opponent to stay home. He couldn't go to St. Louis or Columbia or Springfield or Kansas City and start chipping away at blue areas. I made him show up to forums. I made him say things that people realized weren't popular. He said he was running for two reasons: to make sure that his grandkids had access to guns, and that his grandkids wouldn't have to eat soybean burgers. He said that. And so when you hear that, people are like confused. Like, what do you mean? We don't have shoulders on our roads. Our schools are closing. 30% of the schools in Missouri are running a 4-day week. We're paying our teachers 50th in the country. We're 49th in the country for educational funding. Our hospitals are closing. We don't have access to good paying jobs. And you're worried about your kids eating soybean burgers? So when we force people to actually run, other folks get to hear this message that makes absolutely no sense. And this is the year, I think, for Missouri. People have put their hands up and said Missouri's too red, districts like mine are too red. But listen, we have Kamala Harris and Tim Walz at the top of the ticket. We have a woman running for governor, a pro choice woman running for governor on the Democratic side, and we will have abortion rights on the ballot. If you don't think these things are going to increase turnout and increase people voting, you've got another thing to think about, because this is going to be huge. So when I was out running, when I was out knocking doors, let me tell you the things that I heard. I would knock a door, and not one person ever came to me and told me they were worried about a trans kid using a bathroom. Not one person ever said, I think we should ban books. Not one person ever said we should defund our schools and send that money to private religious schools. Not one person said, I think we should return ARPA funds. We don't need to worry about our highways. We don't need to worry about rural broadband. By having candidates in every single race, on every single ballot, in every single state, it makes this Democratic message be known, right? There are places down in the Boot Hill that haven't had Democrats running for decades. Do you know what that does? It teaches progressive people to vote for Republicans because they have absolutely no one else to vote for. But when we give them a candidate, they may not win in one cycle, they may not win in two cycles, but people are hearing a Democratic message that they like. I would knock doors and people would tell me, I can't vote for you because I'm a Christian, which is another whole thing. But they would say that, but then they would say, I like your message. I agree with you. So that's what deep canvassing does. That's what having a candidate everywhere does. And that's why, friends, that we need to think about supporting races that we know won't flip in one cycle. That's a hard sell, right? To tell people you ought to give money to someone that you know can't win this cycle. And the reason we do it is to build benches. The reason we do it is because people are sticking their neck out in rural spaces, and it's immoral to walk away from them and not to fund them. If we ask folks to run, we should have their back. And that's what we are doing. When we talk about information silos, like Sarah was referring to, a lot of people are using Facebook for their information. But I'll tell you this, friends, a lot of people could read the newspapers in my district and get the same information, because we don't have progressive people writing columns, because they give space to every single one of our elected Republicans who repeat the same lines over and over again, right? So you have smart people, very literate people, opening up their newspaper and seeing the same messages that they would see if they opened up Facebook. We also need to talk about this. Red states are the way they are a lot of times because of gerrymandering, right? And we know that people, the rich, wealthy, well connected folks, are using states like Missouri as a playground to do really awful things, to run cases up to SCOTUS so that they can get a favorable ruling, right? Why do you think we couldn't get the repayment on student loans or forgiveness of student loans? Because my AG fought it, because Missouri's AG fought it. If we didn't have Mississippi, then we wouldn't have had Dobbs. We would still have Roe if it weren't for Mississippi. So they are using these red states to impact every single person. And it's so great to be on this call where people see me. They see my community. They say your community is worth it and we're going to work for it, because I'm not kidding, friends. For decades, we have not been seen. My friend Michelle Hornish is on this call, and she wrote a column today about the fact that we're in red states and you guys see us. And that's so important for us to know that we matter. And like Sarah said, we make a difference. When I ran, I got beat pretty badly. I got 25% of the vote. But what does 25% of the vote do to the top of the ticket, right? It didn't elect me, but what would it do for a governor, right? This is how we bring back democracy. I promise you, it's going to go straight through red states. We will be the ones to flip enough folks to claw our way back to democracy. And I'm so proud to be here with you guys today. Thank you for seeing rural communities.
It's so great to hear your stories, Jess. So we're going to just, I have a few questions for Jess, and we just want to talk for a few minutes before opening it up for questions. But I guess you talked, Jess, about we need to make sure that we are running in every district, even ones that you can't flip. Do you have any tips for how to be most successful in those places? Or is there any sort of grassroots infrastructure that can support these candidates when they run?
Actually, my group does. Blue Missouri, we are one of the only organizations who funds down ballot Democrats. And so we're not against the Democratic Party, right? We're able to work together because we fill in the gap where the Democratic Party is not able to fund every single candidate. But the members of Blue Missouri are willing to say, hey, we know this isn't going to flip in a cycle, but we're going to give it anyway because we need to build a bench. So my organization really does. I started calling folks last night to tell them that we are going to fund them. And you cannot imagine what it's like to call someone who has $500 and tell them that we're going to double or triple their budget. Because friends, I don't know if you know, every yard sign costs $5. If we get it from, a union, which we should, a union shop. Every one of those big signs that we use in farm areas, in big rural areas, those are $100. To get literature, it's going to cost you a couple $1,000s. And what about gas? Gas money for someone to drive. My state legislative district is 4 counties, where in St. Louis, it would be several neighborhoods. I'm driving 4 counties. And so that's where gas money is helpful. So groups like Blue Missouri, Every State Blue, we support folks that we know may not be able to flip it in one cycle. And Sarah, would you tell us a little bit more about the organizations that you work with? And I'm really interested in you talking about rural youth and how you are activating rural young folks to turn out votes in rural communities.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll just give you a flavor of a few of the groups that we support. On the youth front, we support a group called Collective Renaissance Georgia, and they are young people working in the Black Belt of Georgia. Again, when you picture rural people, don't just picture white people. In rural Georgia and North Carolina, it's mostly Black folks, especially young people. 30% of young people in these areas are Black, Latino, Asian American, Native American. So they are specifically working with folks that aren't in college, right? Because a lot of the youth organizing you think about, it's happening on college campuses. In a lot of the rural places, it's happening in workplaces, or it's happening at coffee shops, or it's happening where people are getting together for like a community event. And so they do like bus tours where they have like a bus, they go around, they set up like a really fun event in the middle of the town square. They pull chairs together and are talking with folks and registering voters there. They go to the football game and they'll have a like a tailgate and they'll be registering voters in those places. So we work with a group called New Rural Project, and they're in 7 counties in the southern part of North Carolina, and they actually get folks together in barbershops and beauty salons. They have these talks. The barbershop talks are called FADE, Fruitful African American Discussions for Empowerment is what it stands for. And folks that come out of those barbershop conversations, I met some of them and their whole lives are changed because suddenly, they're in this small town and they meet other people that are trying to change something for the good in their town. So like they got together and put on a Juneteenth celebration for their little town in southern North Carolina. And they can see the difference that it makes in the community. And then they go on to run for office. One of them ran for mayor and won, actually. Or one of them actually, he worked for the Parks Department. He organized a basketball tournament. Everyone loves basketball in their town. They had 1,000 people play in their basketball tournament from all the counties surrounding. And then at the basketball tournament, they talked to people about voting, registered for people to vote, got them involved in running for their local offices. So finding some really creative tactics like that, I think. So I picture groups like that. And then you can also picture, you had mentioned, Jess, deep canvassing. So we support a group called Down Home North Carolina. They're going to be knocking on like 500,000 doors this year. So they can really scale up. And this is just in small town and rural North Carolina. And they are having these deep listening conversations with people where they connect with them about the issues that are important to them and their shared experience, right? These are neighbors talking to neighbors, really listening and connecting before they ever start persuading. Another group that, just to show the diversity of organizations in our network, the Wisconsin Farmers Union is a great example, right? They organize farmers on issues that farmers care about, right? They're talking about farm issues, but sometimes they talk about gerrymandering in Wisconsin because that is impacting the farm policies because they don't have people who are truly representing them. They are great. They have this whole core of people, farmers, who they pay a small stipend to write op-eds to put in their local newspaper, just like what you were talking about, so that they can fill up the content with like positive news, accurate news information about that farmers care about. And they've gotten, hundreds and hundreds of op-eds placed in their local newspaper. So that's just an example, a few examples. I'm curious to hear from you, Jess. Do you have we often work on these local races, right, where people are working for school board, running for school board, or your rural electric co-op board, or things that are hyper local, and that's really where Democrats are able to get a foothold and representation because it's not so partisan. Do you have these kind of less partisan spaces where you're finding people are able to win and represent their community?
We do. Locally, we don't have any of the crazy school board drama going on in my little community, but I mean, it's 480 people, everyone knows everybody. So if someone is acting, insane, someone's gonna be like, what's wrong with you? But there is a town, St. Joseph, and I know there are some people in the call. I saw they were saying they were from St. Joe, Missouri, where they're having huge issues with their school board. There are Missouri is in trying to pass universal vouchers. We already have something called ESAs, which mean that people get a dollar for dollar tax credit for buying a scholarship for a kid. It can be any kid, it can be 10 kids. They don't know these kids, but I mean, it's great because you get a tax break, right? So now they're going further and trying to make this a universal voucher. Now, we know from states like Arizona, this is absolutely devastating. This dismantles public education and it also leaves states with huge budget shortfalls. In Arizona, they're looking at a $1 billion shortfall from vouchers. And so to see it coming into Missouri, you're seeing regular people who don't normally pay that much attention to politics saying, whoa, 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 right? Because in our communities, our school is everything. It's the biggest employer. It's where most people get their health insurance. It's where every single kid gets breakfast and lunch, right? Where they have access to a free and fair education. So by coming in and attacking rural schools, this is a big thing that Democrats can jump on right now. We saw in Texas, the reason they weren't able to pass universal vouchers is because of rural Republicans, not Democrats, but because rural Republicans stood up because they knew they could not defund their local school, right? They knew that their people would, toss them out of office if they defunded their local school. So this is something that all of us can lean into. And this is something that's not divisive. Just like I said, when I was knocking doors, no one wanted to defund their schools, right? No one wants to take away something that they graduated from and their parents graduated from and their kids are going to school now. So staying on issues like that, and you were talking about abortion earlier. And a lot of people think if you come into rural parts of the country, people are going to be up in arms about, no, they're absolutely not. You know why we live in the country? Because we don't like people telling us what to do. Because I don't want to be part of an HOA. If I want to put up a 6 foot fence, I can put up a 6 foot fence. If I want a donkey in my pasture, I can put a donkey in my pasture, right? I don't want anyone telling me what to do. And that's a big glue to rural communities. So telling someone who is sick or doesn't want children or doesn't want more children or whatever it is, my neighbors will tell you this. They'll say, well, I don't like to think about it, but it's not my business. That should be between a woman and her doctor. When I was knocking doors, I went out at like 7:30 one morning in this little town called Albany, Missouri. I think it's 1,800 people. I taught there for a few years. It was a 4-day school week because we're defunded. So I'm walking down the middle of the street because we don't have sidewalks either. We have no infrastructure, right? No money for rural infrastructure. So I'm walking down the middle of the street and a woman from both sides of the street come down to meet me. And both of them in the early morning in their robes are like, thank you for running. I'm going to vote for you because I'm worried about my daughter. I'm worried about my granddaughter. We can't let this happen with abortion in Missouri, or we can't let it stand. So abortion is really not a huge divisive issue either. I gathered signatures to put it on the ballot. And by the way, in Missouri, we're putting it on the ballot. We needed 180,000 signatures to put it on a ballot. We raised 380,000 signatures. That's how many we gathered, 200,000 more than we needed, because that's how people feel about this in Missouri. So when I was gathering signatures, I was in a little town in a library, and a woman came and signed it, and she stood up and she started texting. She was texting her Bible group to remind them to come and sign the petition to put abortion on the ballot. That's how not divisive it is. So we need to lean into these issues in rural parts of America because it makes a difference.
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to my cousin in Southern Indiana, Republican evangelical Christian preacher, and he said, it's funny because I agree with you on literally everything except for abortion. Like that's the only political issue that we actually don't really have in common. And I'm a Seattle liberal, and he's a Indiana conservative. And I said, that's fine. Like, we don't have to agree on that. And then after Dobbs, we were just catching up earlier this year, and he said, I still hate abortion, but I really think that people should be able to decide for themselves what they do. And I said, Tommy, it just makes me laugh because that's the whole thing. That's what pro-choice means. It means that people get to make the decision for themselves. It doesn't mean that all of us who are pro-choice out there are loving abortion. And he laughed. He said, I just didn't get that before. So anyway, I think, yeah, it is something that if you're just having a human conversation with people, you can make that connection.
Really, and that's why I think a democratic message is so important and why we have candidates on the ground, because people listen to us and they're like, that's not what Fox News told me you believed, right? You don't look or sound or act like I'm supposed to think that you are. When I was in Columbia a couple days ago, I stayed in a hotel and I came down and they had Fox News on, of course they did, in the hotel, right? And I went in and I said, hey, can we turn it to like Food Network, anything but Fox News? And she was like, yeah, sure. But there's a guy in there who has the clicker. And I wasn't going to fist fight him for it. So I sat and I listened to the news for a little bit, and I could not believe, friends, they don't, not only is the news a little different, they don't get the same news we do. It's a constant enraging point. Everything they speak about is something that's supposed to trigger you and make you angry. And so after watching that for 30 minutes, I'm like, I see why people people are angry. And Sarah, could we talk about that for a second? Because I think there's this misconception that there's just a whole lot of rage out here in rural parts, and that we vote against our self-interest because we're just mad, right? Do you have any insights into that and why people may think that?
Well, yes, we were just chatting before everyone joined about that book, White Rural Rage, which if you want to send people into a rural rage, mention that book, right? Because people hate that idea. So it's not that people are enraged; it's that folks in rural communities are really like doing things for themselves under tough circumstances and feel like they could use a hand and some attention and some understanding. And so there is some kind of resentment of folks in the cities and on the coast who are not taking the time to really understand and support, and who have these like I think really like caricatures of rural people in their heads. And so I think that is annoying for folks, but it's not the same thing as rage. I don't know, Jess, what you think there.
Well, the title of the book made me a little angry. But
Yeah.
when I do talk to people that are angry, it's misplaced anger a lot of times. The way they're voting may be misplaced, but the anger comes from a real place of being left behind. My community was 2,500 people 100 years ago. We had barber shops, and we had restaurants, and we had two grocery stores, and we had a bank, and we had a farm implement store, and we had a place where you could buy a truck. And we have raised almost every building in my town. It's 480 people now. I can't buy a gallon of milk within 20 minutes. I can get a vape, I can get a pop, and I can get a six-pack of beer, but I can't buy a gallon of milk, right? And so when you talk to people in these communities, that's what they're feeling. I went to our local betterment meeting one time, and they were talking about bringing a food truck in, and I was like, a food truck? Like, what are we doing bringing a food truck in? That's kind of weird. There's 480 people here, right? And the person who was going to bring it in said this, Jess, elderly people don't have access to hot meals here. And let
Yeah.
that sink in. We don't have access to Meals on Wheels because we're too far away. And we don't have a place where someone who can't get out of their home can get a hot meal. And that's what we're dealing with. And that's why people are angry.
Yeah, and frustrated.
Yeah.
Well, I know there's so many questions popping up on the chat, so I'm going to turn it over to Kitty. Jess and I could talk all day, but let's bring some of y'all's questions into the conversation.
This has been such a great conversation, and I would just want to say thank you. There's a lot of appreciation for both of you in the chat. Jess, there are a few people who would like you to run again for office. Not that you don't have a lot going on with all that you're doing, including being a grandmother, which sort of blew my mind. Are you going to run again for office?
Well, I'm not independently wealthy, which makes makes it difficult because I have to work, and it isn't, it's a long process. I would love to run for office again, maybe someday. I don't have any immediate plans because, yeah, I stay busy with Blue Missouri and speaking and visiting with people like you guys.
You guys touched on so many things, and there's a lot that we can unpack. But there was a question from Catherine Newhouse, which I thought we should revisit from one of your slides, Sarah, which showed that when rural voters were presented with policies that Democrats tend to be the ones supporting, there was a lot of support for them. But the minute it was attached to the fact that it was a Democratic policy, that support really dropped. And seems to be a really important point for those of us on the call who care about democracy, who care about rural voters, who care about all Americans. Why that is, why the brand is so, poorly received in rural America, and what do you see are some of the messages that help sort of persuade people to vote Democratic?
I'd love to hear from Jess. I'll just mention a couple things. I think in small towns and rural communities, it's really all about relationships. And so when you think about it, do people have relationships with folks who are Democrats? Do they have a picture of a Democrat in their mind who is somebody that they feel like has their backs, who they can trust? Is it their, coach or teacher or the person who works in the grocery store that they know? So I think it's just things that are relational are the best way to improve Democrats' brand. So Jess just mentioned yard signs, which I think is in the cities, people say yard signs don't vote, but in the country, they help you identify a candidate or a party or an issue with people, right? People know where everybody lives, right? So if you have a yard sign in your yard, you're actually having a conversation with people about what you care about in the community. So I think just visibility is important. Having people run for all of these local offices, which are much less partisan and really connected to people's everyday lives, is another good way to have people who are Democrats show up in a way that is really helpful to the community. And then one more suggestion that I am very partial to, and I work on with a group called Rural Urban Bridge Initiative, is this idea of community service. So having Democrats, they have a program called Community Works, and Democrats actually get together and do community service, blood drives, scholarships, striping the soccer field, cleanups, trail building, like whatever it is that they need to do in the community. And it's just a way of having Democrats get out there and be folks who are just normal contributors to the community. I think that we just have to do a lot more of that.
You're exactly right. And yard signs matter a lot out here. I have people before an election, probably 20, 30 people that'll say, how are you voting in this election, right? So it's easy when I have signs outside. They can just drive by and know. It also gives people comfort to know that they're not the only person in a community that's planning to vote for Democrats. And like you said, Sarah, we have all kinds of community service events where we all wear our Democrat shirts, so people know that. And I'll say this, with national Democrats, it's one thing, but local Democrats, it's hard to fight against someone who is rural and also a Democrat, because they're used to throwing things about, coastal liberals, all elites, all those things. I'm not an elite, and you know me. You know where I live. You see where I live. I'm not an elite. Yes, of course we're all gun owners because we all hunt, right? So you're saying the things that nobody can deny. Of course I love my local school. I went to it, my kids went to it, my grandkids will go to it, right? So it's hard to argue these stereotypes of liberals when we're running rural folks as Democrats. And so that's again why it's so important to give and to have someone in these races where people aren't hearing a Democratic message, because just like I said, when I knock doors, people are like, oh my God, I agree with her and she's a Democrat. And so there's a cognitive dissonance. You can get online, you can watch TV, you can be a keyboard warrior and you will hear these negative things. But if I'm standing at your door, it's hard for you to attach those to me because I'm talking to you like a human and you realize we all want the same thing.
Yeah. Sarah, another slide that you showed, I think, is a good test case that we can talk about. It was the swing of rural voters in the midterms 2022 in Pennsylvania, and I know you're doing some work in Pennsylvania, supporting groups who are. So I'm wondering if you can sort of talk to us about what you think happened in the midterms in Pennsylvania. What messaging worked? What worked for the groups? What did those groups do that you were supporting that helped make that swing possible towards Democratic candidates, including Senator Fetterman?
Well, yeah, the thing that's happened between 2016 and now is that there has been so much growth in the rural grassroots campaign infrastructure. So not on the political Democrat side, but on the nonprofit groups. And so they're able to get out and talk with people. They're knocking on, like in a legislative district, they'll get out and knock on 30,000 doors in a legislative campaign, right? That makes a huge difference when you're putting up yard signs, you're doing your social media advertising and you are knocking on doors, you're registering voters, you're making sure that all the young people in those community college campuses are registered and turning out. So I think that makes an enormous difference. And then also the candidate. I mean, they had two great candidates in Pennsylvania, Shapiro and Fetterman. I think Fetterman really appealed to rural people because he was bold. He stood for things. He was connected to his values, and he also was plain talking. And he didn't talk like an elite, even though he's very intelligent and well educated. And so I think that those are the things that make the difference. It's not so much the message, it's the messenger and then the organizing. And that is enough to move a few vote percentages. And that's all you need, as Jess was talking about.
Yeah, that aligns with what you've been saying too, Jess. It's the messenger.
Yeah, and I don't know if we've talked about this yet, but the Harris Walls ticket has produced such excitement. When I go to Walmart and someone sees me, they're like, "Oh my God," right? I went to my daughter's play and people were coming up just left and right. I walked by this woman, she said Kamala. Like I walked by her and she just said her name and I was like, "Yeah, Kamala," right? But then once Harris added Walls, it has just exploded here. Everywhere I go, that's what people want to talk about. And I'm really one that I don't like to talk about federal elections that much because honestly, all the horrible and hateful things that are happening to Missourians are happening in Jeff City, right, in the capital. But to see this excitement, to see people knowing, that we have a chance. I was driving through Ringgold County, Iowa, which is in the middle of nowhere, and I was looking for this house that I always pass by that has these horrible hand-drawn signs about Biden and all the stuff. So I was looking for that. Before I got to that, I looked at the other side of the road and there was this small sign. And this person had taken duct tape and put it over Biden. It said Harris underneath and they wrote Kamala. And they planted it in front of their house next to the cornfields. And I was like, oh my God. Oh my God. I've never seen a Biden sign in this county on this highway ever. I've been driving this county since 2016. The flags are going down. One Trump flag came down and they replaced it with the Gadsden flag, which isn't much better, but hey, we'll take what we can get, right? I mean, there's excitement and it feels like hope in rural areas, and we just haven't been able to feel that in so long that I can't tell you, friends, what this means to us, and especially adding Walls on there, a man who sees us, who knows what's going on in this part of the country.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. A couple of, I'd like to get into sort of the abortion issue and ballot measures and how you see that sort of impacting and motivating people in, Missouri, Iowa, Arizona, to name a few. But there are just a couple of questions, Sarah, about how your fund works. A question from Patrick White, which is a good one, is if you support 150 groups, how do you decide who to fund, and are you at risk at spreading resources too much?
We've been very fortunate to have some significant funders, and so we do have, we're able to give $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 to the groups that we support. So thinking about spreading ourselves thin, I think we are usually able to give folks a somewhat transformative amount of funding where they can really use it to invest in a staff person or a program. So we don't feel like we're spread too thin at this point. Although I would say that the groups that we support right now, as they're moving from their kind of 501c3 voter engagement to their 501c4 political campaigns, they need to ramp up very quickly to meet the opportunity. And they have big gaps, multi-million-dollar gaps right now. And so more support is needed. And then we decide who to fund. We take a state approach. So we fund deeply in 12 states and we fund across 20 states, including Missouri. We fund groups in Missouri as well. And we have staff people assigned to a particular state, and they get to know the state over time. They know the groups. There aren't usually that many rural groups in a state. So if you get to know one, you can get to know all of them pretty quickly. They work with the state kind of progressive tables. And so it's pretty clear who is kind of able to absorb more resources. And we really like to place bets on kind of new and exciting efforts and help them grow from like a small core into something that is sustainable. And then we support them along the way so that they can sustain themselves over time. So there are dozens of groups out there that we were their first contributor and supported them over multiple years until they were able to really have a sustained presence.
Great, thank you. And then another attendee asked the question between sending money to RDI versus the direct candidate contributions. Is it and both? Kind of, everybody needs just small d dollars.
Yeah, it's both and. I mean, I might
Both
be
and
here, but I would say if you're going to give money to candidates, give to local candidates, like state legislature on down, because those are the folks who really need it the most. If you know about like a U.S. Senate candidate or even like a U.S. Congress candidate, they probably have enough money to do their TV ads. It's these local candidates where your $100, $500 can make like the world of difference for them, like Jess was just talking about. So I would recommend that for your candidate giving. And you can probably, Jess or other people on this call can give you a whole list of folks that could use their support. And then the thing about the nonprofit groups that are doing the grassroots work is that they can connect with folks that the candidate can't or the Democrats can't because they are representing a particular issue or constituent that is connecting with their local community. And sometimes people don't want to start the conversation with the Democrats, but they'll start a conversation with the person who is working to rebuild their local city park, and they'll get involved that way. And then they move kind of up the ladder into politics from there. So it's really important to have both.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I appreciate it. We're getting close to time, so I just would love to hear what you both are thinking about the abortion ballot initiatives, what we can do in order to help people on the ground in those states. Jess, in Missouri, like, what could the community of Big Tent do, for instance, for the people of Missouri to help them understand the importance of that ballot initiative?
We should know within a couple of days whether we've actually been able to put it on the ballot. I have no doubt in my mind that it's going to be on the ballot because we just raised we gathered too many signatures. Yeah. But it's going to be an education campaign after that, telling people that this isn't pro-abortion, what they think, right? It's between a woman and her doctor. And folks should know that Missouri was the first state to ban abortion after Roe fell. Our AG was in front of cameras within minutes to sign away every woman's right. But they should also know this. It's been decades since women in my part of the state have had access to abortion because they closed every clinic within driving distance. There was one clinic open and it's in St. Louis, and that's 5.5 hours from me. So we've been dealing with this for decades, and we've had enough. And so the education, campaign will come in telling people that it's just making sure that women who can't afford to have a child, women who don't want to have a child, a woman who has been, assaulted, or someone who is sick and isn't able to deliver a child, that they should have access to life-saving care and reproductive choices. So it's just really going to come down to that, which takes money, right, to get the message out to folks. But I'm telling you, everyone I talk to is like, not for me, but it's not my business. And I think Tim Walz even says that, right? Mind your own damn business. Yeah. Hey, sounds good to me.
Yeah.
It's a great slogan.
It's a great slogan. Yeah. If you have any, once you know if it will be on the ballot, if you have any calls to action that folks who are on this call can do from their home states who don't live in Missouri, we'd love to have access to that and help out in any way we can.
Absolutely. And can I I saw something in the chat. Somebody had asked if writing postcards is helpful in rural areas.
Oh yeah, thank you.
that was one of the most impactful things that happened because Democrats left rural America, but guess who else did? The Republicans. We have organizing in the churches, so they didn't have to come here, right? And so the fact that people were getting handwritten cards telling them to vote for somebody, I had people that were absolutely enraged, like sent it back to me, return to sender. So that lets you know that they read that and they were like, oh my God, someone is writing for a Democratic candidate. Friends, postcards make a huge difference in rural spots.
Great.
They're coming from neighbors, right?
Yes.
Okay. That's really good to know because we support some postcarding, some letter writing that have handwritten components to them. Ooh, sorry. And that seems to be sort of the secret sauce. Well, before we let you go, I just want to remind everyone on this call, our friend John Cooper said, once everyone gets the recap, please share this call with others in your network. It's so important that we make sure that we're talking to all Americans about what's at stake this election and that we do care about our entire country, that we want to be one country. We're not interested in red states and blue states. We want to be Americans. And then also, I really hope that people will join us tomorrow night for this important conversation with the Brennan Center about Project 2025. This is not going away. This is what really would be enacted if Donald Trump wins again. Jess knows because she lives in a state where a lot of Project 2025 is already state law and impacting her neighbors and her family. So we hope you'll join us tomorrow night. And Jess, Sarah, thank you so much for your work and for your energy and enthusiasm. We're so, so grateful to you all and can't wait to see you under the tent again. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Bye.